Hello, everybody, and welcome to the first set of our Great Depression notes. Today, we're going to talk about some of the causes of the Great Depression, some of the reasons that our economy was so sick. Some of the main ones we're going to talk about today are the high tariffs and war debts, our different monetary policies, so tariffs, things like that, unequal distribution of wealth, overproduction both in industries and in farms, and then tomorrow we're going to talk more about the stock market crash specifically. So your warm-up today, you had to choose which of those following things do you think happened in the 1930s. There can be more than one. So I don't know if I told you this in class or not, but they all happened. It's just some of them didn't happen in the 30s. Okay? So Wizard of Oz was released in the 1930s. Calvin Coolidge was not reelected in the 1930s. Technically, he was never reelected. He finished serving Harding's term, and then he was elected to his own term. But he served like a term and a half, and he was not reelected or even elected in the 30s. That was both 1920s. Bank robbers compared themselves to Robin Hood. That is actually true. We'll talk about the FDIC, the insurance company for banks, later on. A couple in their early 20s went on a cross-country crime spree. That is true, and most of you already know their names. Hopefully somebody said it. Bonnie and Clyde. And then veterans of the Great War did march on Washington in the 1930s, and Hitler became Chancellor of Germany in 1930s. Hitler was actually elected Chancellor of Germany the same year that FDR was elected President of the United States. So if you're keeping tally, the A, C, D, E, and F all happened in the 1930s. So the only one that didn't was B. All right, so at the end of the 1920s, there's going to be some major problems going on in the American economy, and I think we're going to talk about 8 of them today. The first one is that wages remained very, very low. Okay, all through the 1920s, there was a complete flip in the way that the government was going. Again, government went back to laissez-faire, which means the government is not going to be backing up unions the way that Teddy Roosevelt did, which means unions are losing their power. Unions are going to remain very, very weak for a couple of reasons. First, the government's not helping them. The government's not supporting them. The second is that it's hard to unionize different classes of people. The third is that most unions did not include Black Americans, and because of the Great Migration, a lot of the workers in the cities are Black now. And if you're not going to be part of the union, why would you help the union negotiate? You wouldn't go on strike if the union's not going to help you. So unions remain very weak. And because unions can't fight for higher wages, wages are going to stay lower. The second problem is that the consumer debt is too high. We talked about this in the 1920s, that instant gratification where they convinced people to, buy on credit, basically, when you're doing that installment buying. That's debt, right? And consumer buying is going to start to decline. For the same reason that whenever you get that magic little piece of plastic, whenever you turn 18 and go to college, and they give you that student credit card, there's a limit on that. And whenever you approach that limit, you start to spend less because you just don't have that money. Same thing's going to happen to people in the end of the 20s, beginning of the 1930s. And they're going to realize we owe so much money, we have to stop spending. And so that if they can't spend, what they're buying is going to decrease. And so factories are not selling as much, okay? But they're still overproducing. Because consumer buying is declining, sales are falling. But companies don't say, oh, we're not selling as much, or we don't need to make as much. They don't do that. They do not respond with lower production. If they had responded with lower production, they probably could have kept prices stable, right? Because if you start producing less, you lower the supply, which will keep the prices higher. But they didn't do that. They said, oh, no, we really want to sell, so crank out as much as you can. On top of that, you have a continuing depression among the farmers. Now, this is not just the farmers where the Dust Bowl is. This is the farmers all across the country. They're going to have a huge depression all through the 20s because they were overproducing. They were producing at World War I levels, and we weren't buying as much food as we were before. So to combat the falling prices and to combat the overproduction and the falling prices of food, one Tennessean is going to come up with this kind of ingenious way of doing a market. If you've ever seen like an old timey type movie or show, Little House on the Prairie, those of you who watched the Sergeant York extra credit movie, you notice that whenever people came to the store, they had a basket with them, and they'd just walk straight up to the counter and tell the shopkeeper what they wanted, and the shopkeeper would go around and pick it up for them. And then they'd bring everything to them and put it in their basket and charge them. So most stores worked that way, and they had to hire a lot of employees because you don't want people standing around waiting all day long in big cities. So you had to hire employees to actually run and pick everything off the shelves so that you could get the customers through quickly. But that's a lot of overhead, right? You're paying a lot of different people a salary to do that. So Clarence Saunders, he owns a grocery store called the Piggly Wiggly, and it's in Memphis, and he actually comes up with kind of an ingenious way to run a grocery store. And the way it works, you've got this turnstile here, okay? And you would come into the store through this turnstile. See, they've got it fenced off, so there's only one way out and one way in. Totally couldn't do that today because of fire codes. But you would go in, you would pick up a basket, and he had it fenced off. So in order to get to the register, you had to go up and down every aisle. So you went up and down every aisle in the grocery store, and then came back up through this line to check out. This is ingenious for several reasons. One, you can cut the number of employees you need. You need maybe a couple of employees to run registers, and maybe an employee or two at tops to stock the shelves. And if you really want to get stingy about it, you can make the people who are working the registers stock the shelves after the store closes. So, like, theoretically, you could run this whole thing with 2 people. And so you're way cutting down on your costs, right? The second kind of ingenious thing about it is people start to impulse buy. So before, whenever you went to the store with a list, you left with just what was on that list. But now you go to the store with a list and you're walking around the store looking for everything on it, and oh, that looks good, I'll grab that too, right? It's the reason why nobody's ever left Walmart with just the one thing they went in looking for, right? You go into Walmart for like a hairbrush and you leave after you buy $100 worth of stuff, right? That's just impulse buying. It's what these stores count on. But you do need to know this. He is in your standards. Clarence Saunders was the first self-service grocery store in Memphis, Tennessee. Business owners are also going to find a way to cut down on their advertising cost. Instead of paying for great big billboards, they started putting advertisements on their employees' uniforms. So, for example, these girls worked in the factories that made these stockings, and they were told, they were given these uniforms to wear. And, well, I mean, look at it. Look at my legs. My stockings have been treated with Duracell and will never ladder. Ladder is what we call, like, running in a stocking. Now you get those long kind of tears. They will never ladder. They will never run. Okay? So they are basically walking advertisements for this company. And that's going to be, for the most part, something that still happens today, right? I mean, think about it. If you work at McDonald's, you've got that little McDonald's symbol on your shirt, right? So if you have to go do errands after you work, most people aren't going to change their clothes. So you're a walking advertisement for McDonald's everywhere you go. Little bit of monetary policy here. Congress is going to try to help the farmers. They passed the McNary-Haugen bill to provide price relief for farmers. They basically create subsidies. The government would basically buy up all the surplus. They would buy up all the extra crops that were grown, which would lower the supply, right? If you lower the supply that's allowed to everybody else, if the government has bought all the extra and now there is just now barely enough for everybody else in the country has a smaller supply. And smaller supplies make prices go up. So the effect would push the prices up because of that law of supply and demand. So if the government buys up all the extra, you don't have a big supply anymore, prices go up, everyone's happy. Congress passes this bill twice, and both times it was vetoed by Coolidge. So they pass it once, it goes to Coolidge, he vetoes it, says, I don't like this part of it. They fix that part, send it back to Coolidge, and he vetoes it again. They are not able to pass it over his veto. They don't have that many votes. Excuse me. So this never actually goes into effect, but this would have helped the farmers. The fifth problem in our economy is that some of the major key industries were failing. Remember, we talked about there were some industries that so many other things were tied to. We talked about railroads were one at the very beginning of the 1890s. That if you were working, there was a large chance that what you were working would be using railroads in some way, right? So if you were in the steel industry, you were making the rails for railroads. If you were in the Pullman car factories, were making cars for railroads, and Swift and meat packing, and they were using railroads to ship them. So railroads were a big key industry. So the government had given lots of help to railroads to help build this up. So the government was kind of banking on these industries. And when they start to fail, not only is the government not getting as much in tax revenue as they were getting from them before, but a lot of the people who are in jobs related to those industries start to lose their jobs too. So railroads, excuse me, they are losing, they're failing because of the transition to automobiles. And one of the things that really gets hurt by this is the lumber industry. Not so much steel, because automobiles still used steel. But railroads used a lot of timber. They used a lot of wood, and cars don't. So the lumber industry is going to be hurt here. The other industry is the coal mining, because most Americans by this point are making the transition, to gas and electricity. They're not heating their homes with coal anymore. So that's going to hurt people. So the automobile industry, it's taking over railroads. There is a really good episode of Adam Ruins Everything on Netflix. I suggest you watch it. It's awesome. And he's got one where Adam ruins cars, and it gives you a lot of the history behind how cars became so prevalent in American society. It's really interesting. You should watch it. The sixth problem in American society is protectionism. Protectionism is high tariffs. When you raise your tariff in order to block foreign trade, right? You raise the taxes on foreign goods so that foreign countries have to raise their prices, so American companies have the cheapest goods, and you're buying American instead of foreign. The tariff they passed in 1922 is the Fordney-McCumber tariff. Remember, this was the highest tariff in American history up until this point. And European countries get mad at us for that. They always have, they always will. Whenever we raise our tariffs on them, they respond with raising their own tariffs on us. And the result is going to be a trade war that hurts American sales, especially farmers. This is happening right now. We raised our tariffs on China to try to force China into doing something. And China and Germany and a whole bunch of other places, we raised our tariffs on them. And all of these countries have responded by raising their tariffs on us. Well, we buy from them stuff we can afford to live without, right? Like, we can afford to live without foreign cars. We can afford to live without cheap Chinese-made factory goods. Our prices will go up, but we can exist without them. They buy mostly food stuff from us. Their biggest imports from America is crops. So if they raise their tariffs, farmers can't afford to raise their prices on their crops, because if they raise the prices on their crops, people won't buy them. There's just some foods you won't pay a lot of money for. So whenever the other countries raise their tariffs on us, it hurts the farmers, because that's how farmers make their money. Farmers don't make their money selling food to other Americans. They make their money selling large quantities of food to other countries. And they're not able to do that whenever tariffs go up. You're going to see, we'll talk about this some more tomorrow, but you're going to see a lot of penny auctions where farmers are going bankrupt. This is a picture of a penny auction. I'll show it to you again tomorrow. And yes, when I say penny auction, farms were literally sold for a couple dollars, like just pennies. The seventh problem in American economy is unpaid war debts that were owed to the United States. Even though we were doing the Dawes Plan, even though we were doing that money merry-go-round, where we gave money to Germany and then they used it to help their economy, and they gave money to Britain and France, which helped their economy, and then Britain and France gave money to us, there were still, things were bad in those countries too, and they started not paying off their debts. As a matter of fact, every country except Finland defaulted on their World War I debts to the United States. Every country except Finland. Okay? And Finland didn't finish paying off their World War I debts to us until 1976. So, I mean, that tells you how long it took them to finish paying off all this money that they borrowed from us. Every other country, they just stopped paying it, and we kind of did nothing. The next one is over speculation. Okay. When you speculate something, okay, you buy thinking that the price will increase and you will be able to sell it at a higher price. So you can speculate on the stock market, right? Those of you who've had economics, that's what you're supposed to do, right? You buy stocks when they're cheap, and then you wait for the price to go up and you sell them when they get at the highest you think they're going to go, and you earn money that way. So you can speculate on that. You can speculate on collectibles, right? There are people, like my little pop figurines that I have on my desk. I actually open them because my son plays with them. But there are people who buy them and never open them because they're convinced that they'll be worth more money someday. So they can just leave them in mint condition in the box and then wait a couple years and be able to sell them for a lot of money. People do it on land, right? If you find out there's going to be a new Walmart built, or a new shopping mall, or a new interstate built somewhere, a lot of people will go in and try to buy as much land around where it's going to be built as they can, because they know if they build those things, then other businesses will want to be near them. So you'll be able to go in and sell that land to other businesses for really high prices. I mean, think about it. You'll never see a Walmart by itself in a field somewhere. There are always stores and little strip malls that get built near Walmarts because that's where people are going to be, so you can draw those customers to you. So, I mean, that's type of speculation in land, okay? Now, the problem we have in speculation is not a bad thing, right? Everyone does it. It's how you make money. Whenever those house flipping shows where you buy like an old rundown house and you fix it up and you make it profitable to sell it, that's speculation. Nothing wrong with that. The problem we have in the end of 1920s, early 1930s is that there is over speculation. People are betting too much that things will become more valuable, and they just don't get more valuable. So you have over speculation on the stock market. Okay. Now, in the 1920s, there is no government regulation. There is no rules on how many stocks you can buy and what you can use to buy it with. So a lot of people buy their stock on margin. Okay? And what on margin means is that you buy the stock, but you don't pay for it until after you cash it out. So you're going to pay for that stock with the margin or that chunk of money you earn. Okay? You buy stocks on credit, basically. And your stockbroker basically fronts you or loans you the money to buy the stock, and then whenever you sell the stock, that money you used, your loan gets taken out of your profits. Okay. Now the problem with that is if you lose money, you still owe your stockbroker back. So you've lost money, plus you now owe all this money you borrowed to buy the stock in the first place. The second place you've got over speculation in the 1920s is land, especially land in Florida. You have people, I think I've told you guys this before, you have people who are buying land sight unseen in Florida because the tourist industry is booming in Florida and everybody wants to get involved there and everybody wants to go build businesses there. So people will pay, their life savings for a deed to land in Florida, and they get to Florida and it's in the Everglades. So it's like 1.5 feet underwater. It happens. And that's just the legal deeds. There were a lot of people who spent a lot of money on deeds to land in Florida, packed up their family, drove to Florida, and the land didn't exist. It was some kind of charlatan who sold them a fake land deed. So you've got a lot of that. Okay, so this is how the New York Stock Exchange works, right? You've got the commodities sellers inside the rings, and then the brokers walk around and, hey, I need, 15 stocks of such and such and 17 stocks of such and such. And these guys have to be really good at math because they have to figure out if the price goes up or down and by how much. And there was just a little chalkboard in there that they would write the number on. So this is some of the speculation you can see, right? Shorecrest, they're going to build these big, beautiful homes here. Go ahead and buy your land plot now. Okay. Everjune Gardens in Florida. Real estate, have buyers for 4 or 5 building lots. Greatest land offering, $15 per acre, 10 acres for $150. You have this whole group of people, driving down to Florida. That's like a wagon train almost. By the time of the 1928 election, there were serious slumps in 2 major areas. We've talked about this before. Anytime you see a slump in either of these 2 areas, you know the economy is in trouble. And that is new car sales and new housing sales. Because everybody wants the American dream. And the American dream is to have your own car, to own your own home. So if people aren't buying those 2 things, it's because they can't afford to. It's not because they don't want them. It's because they can't afford to. So anytime those 2 areas start to see sales slumps, you should start getting worried. It's not time to panic yet, but you should start getting worried because that means something's wrong with the economy that people can't afford to buy those things. Now, both of those slumps are going to send a ripple effect across the country. Just like the railroad used to be the center of the industry, the car, we talked about this in the 1920s, the car becomes the center of the industry. And so there are so many other industries involved in making cars, and so many other industries involved in building houses, construction, electrical, plumbing, furniture, all of these things go into building a house. So if people aren't buying houses, less houses get built, and then all of those other areas, all of those other types of companies, industries, they start failing. Now, here's the thing. The government knew this was happening. Everybody knew this was happening. It wasn't like they didn't notice. The problem is the government is not going to try to fix those problems. Those 8 problems that we saw happening, the government's not going to step in and fix it because the government in the 1920s and 30s, well, 1920s at least, had that basic belief in laissez-faire. That basic belief in the government should leave it alone. They should stay out of the economy. The 1928 election, the Republican's going to win. His name is Herbert Hoover. And he wins very easily with a slogan that promised continuing prosperity, right? 1920s, everyone's doing pretty good, right? With the exception of farmers. But everyone's doing pretty good. There's a big boom. Everyone's making money. People are becoming millionaires off of selling stock. You've got a lot of people who are getting promoted because the businesses are booming. So you've got all this stuff happening in the 20s. Everyone's feeling pretty good. And Hoover's going to play off of that. He says, we've got a Republican president now. Elect another Republican, right? And I promise a chicken in every pot and 2 cars in every garage. Okay? That's his slogan that promises, everything's going to be good. Now, remember, chicken was the expensive meat back then. Chicken was not the cheap meat. This is before you had like the industrial farming of chickens like we've got now. All the chickens were free range, which means they got eaten by wild animals a lot. So chickens were harder to raise. Beef was the cheap meat. So, I mean, if you had beef every night, it was because you couldn't afford the chicken. Okay? So, if you're promising chicken, it'd be like promising a T-bone steak in every pan or whatever. Okay? But there is a depression cycle that's already in place. And Hoover takes a lot of flack for causing the depression. And he didn't really cause it. He didn't really stop it, but depression cycle was already happening. And once you're in a depression cycle, if the government doesn't stop in and stop one of those steps, it will just keep going and going and going. This is Herbert Hoover, and this is the depression cycle. Make sure you write this down. You need to know it. So what starts the depression cycle, the thing that makes it start going, is when people have no money. Okay? They have low wages. They have overextended credit, so they've borrowed too much money. They don't have any money left in their credit line. They're unemployed. When people have less money, they spend less money. Okay? When they have no money, they spend less. When they spend less, demand for goods goes down because no one's buying. When demand for goods goes down, eventually the businesses catch on. They say nobody's buying, we don't need to make as much. Production goes down. So, no money, demand goes down, production goes down. They start making less of whatever the product is. Well, if you're making less than you were before, you don't need as many employees. So you lay off or fire a lot of your workers, which means you now have a whole new group of people who were making money who are now unemployed and are not making money, which means now you have a whole new group of people that have no money to spend, which means this group of people spends less money. And when they spend less money, the demand for good goes down again. And when the demand for good goes down again, factories say, oh, we're selling even less now. So production goes down again. When production goes down again, you definitely don't need as many workers as you got now. So even more workers are laid off, which means more jobs and more income is lost, which means these people now start spending less money, which means that demand for good goes down again, and it's just a vicious cycle. And it will just keep going and going and going, and it will not stop until someone, usually the government, steps in between one of these steps and does something to stop it. They either give people money, right? They either give people money so that the demand for good goes up because they start spending money, okay? Or they increase production, which gives people jobs, okay? Or they find a way to give people jobs. That's how most governments do it. Most governments will create jobs for their citizens, so the citizens are doing something productive. They're earning money, which means they're spending more money, which means demand goes up, which means private businesses can then increase their employment, right? The production goes up, you need to hire more employees. That's how most people do it. But that thought process didn't exist in the 1920s because of laissez-faire, right? If the government steps in and gives people jobs, that is laissez-faire. That is the government interfering in the economy. And they didn't think like that in the 1920s. All right, and that is the end of this set of notes. On the next set, we will talk about the stock market crash and how Hoover dealt with that.